Good evening and welcome to Around the World with Fred. Fred is going to be talking in a few minutes, but I'd just like to remind everyone that our film festival begins at the end of February and then continues after 2 weeks online. So you can get your tickets later in January, February, unless you are a donor. And you can go to eastbayjewishfilm.org to see the many films that we have playing for our 29th year. Fred Rosenbaum is a noted author, historian, and adult educator. He is a founder and director of the former Lehrhaus Judaica in Berkeley, described as the largest Jewish adult education center in the Western United States. He earned a bachelor's degree at Washington University in St. Louis, and then studied the history of Nazi Germany as a Fulbright scholar in West Germany. He earned a master's degree in European history at the University of California at Berkeley. Inspired by the life of Franz Rosenzweig, he left traditional academia in 1974 to co-found Lehrhaus Judaica with the late Seymour Fromer. He is also the author of several books, including Cosmopolitans, Taking Risks, Visions of Reform, and Here There Are No Sarahs. The question and answer session, which is very exciting, it's sometimes even not just because Fred's talks are really great, but pretty good, will be conducted by Sandy Zimmerman and Fred Rosenbaum. Thank you, Fred, so much for sharing your knowledge with our community, and take it away.
Okay, thank you, Reba, for arranging this, and Neely for helping on the tech side. Really appreciate that. So Noodle, made in 2007, is billed as a comedy and has some very funny situations and quips. This is Israeli humor. It's a subset of Jewish humor and distinct from the hapless East European schlemiels and schlemazels. It's also different from American Jewish jokes, especially the kind that poke fun at Jews trying too hard to assimilate into Gentile society, like the jest, President Lincoln was Jewish. His real name was Len Cohen, but he changed it when he went into politics. This does not resonate with Israelis. Their comedy tends toward ridicule, satirizing the postal system, the telephone company, the bureaucracy, or any prime minister, past or present. Sometimes it consists of mocking another person by exaggerating his or her faults, as the sharp-tongued Gila does in the film. And because Israel is a country of Jewish immigrants from diverse lands, the Middle East and North Africa, former Soviet Union, Ethiopia, Argentina, Western Europe, America, all of them trying to speak Hebrew, it leads to amusing linguistic and cultural misunderstandings. In Noodle, we have an example of this cross-cultural humor, a laughable, sometimes ludicrous encounter between a Tel Aviv family of middle-class Sabras and a 6-year-old Chinese boy. It works on that comic level, but the film also delves deeply into Israeli society. To be sure, it does not deal with the Jewish state's most painful and polarizing conflicts, the seemingly never-ending war between Arab and Jew, the deep rifts between the religious and the secular, between the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim, between new immigrants and native Sabras, and more recently between Netanyahu's extreme right-wing governing coalition and the massive street demonstrations against it. But the drama does bring to light two other social concerns that have not gotten the attention they have deserved. The plight of war widows like Miri, and that of the migrant workers, mostly from East Asia, like the Chinese boy's mother. These two disturbing topics are rarely mentioned, even in comprehensive sociological studies of Israel. After October 7th, both of these dilemmas loom larger in the public eye. Tragically, in the merciless Hamas attack and the Gaza war that has followed, about 250 war widows have already been added to the 5,000 now living in Israel, most of whom lost their husbands in the Yom Kippur and Lebanon wars. Also victimized by Hamas have been migrant workers. Among the roughly 1,000 civilians who were killed in the appalling massacre were 39 Asians, largely from Thailand and Nepal, and almost the same number were taken hostage. Their suffering has been widely covered in the Hebrew press. The issue of migrant labor will soon become even more salient. Unsurprisingly, since October 7th, there has been a sharp decline in the number of Palestinians working in Israeli agriculture, construction, or as domestics. 100,000 have recently been barred from entering Israel proper. And their jobs will be filled by foreigners. Just last month, the East African country of Malawi announced it's sending 5,000 guest workers to Israel. But above all, Noodle is a film about the inner lives of Israeli women, a breakthrough when it was released 17 years ago. The two leading roles are sisters, each vulnerable, but also strong in her own way as they relate to a young child and to each other. In contrast, the estranged husband of one of them is rather weak and indecisive. The film, which was nominated in 10 categories at the Israeli Academy Awards, was made by one of Israel's most path-breaking directors, Ayelet Menahemi, who also co-wrote the screenplay. Let's look at the first slide. And there you see her. She has always been on the cutting edge, exploring topics that make people uncomfortable. Back in 1987, at age 24, she directed a film about Tel Aviv's seamy side. It showed homeless teenagers living in chaotic, decadent surroundings, engaging in promiscuous gay sex and prostitution. Images never before seen on the Israeli screen, and perhaps for that reason, well received by the critics and the public. The poster in the lower left reflects the dystopian theme of that film, or Avim, crows would be the translation of that title. Menahemi herself lived as an offbeat bohemian artist and was described in the press as belonging to the punk subculture. Her next film was Tel Aviv Stories in 1992, another success and a forerunner of Noodle because it featured three fiercely independent women. If you look very closely at that poster, you see the woman in the middle is Anat Waxman, the same woman, same actress who plays Gila in Noodle. But in this billboard, notice, none of the actresses' names are listed, nor that of the director. Now, soon afterward, after Tel Aviv Stories, Menahemi had an identity crisis and turned away from Israeli cinema. She made Noodle only after a hiatus of a decade and a half, during which she immersed herself in the practice of vipassana, a kind of Buddhist meditation to achieve tranquility. She visited Nepal, Tibet, and China, and spent 3 years in India. Okay, we can remove that. Now, no doubt, due to so many years of seeking calm and stability in her own life, Noodle has little of the agitation and near madness of her earlier work. So while the content of the movie is pioneering, that is, these two social problems that have been overlooked, and the storyline is highly original, the fabric of the film is purposely ordinary. The low-budget movie was shot entirely with a handheld camera, and Menahemi forgoes any spectacular cinematography. She said she wanted it to be like comfortable clothes. Let's look at the next slide. For the lead, the twice-widowed flight attendant, Miri, she cast the glamorous Israeli actress Mili Avital, then in her early 30s. But Menahemi thought Avital was, quote, too young and too pretty for the role. So the director had her wear padding that filled her out, enlarging her torso and widening her thighs. She also strapped on weights that made her gait heavier, the weight of grief. And there you see her in the two photos below, looking very different than the glamorous Avital. Okay, let's scroll down to the next one. To play Gila, Miri's older sister, Menahemi chose another accomplished Israeli actress, Anat Waxman. In real life, Waxman and Mili Avital are best friends, and the two are quite convincing as sisters, competitive, caustic, even hurting one another, but loving. A few years after the film, Waxman, acid-tongued in Israeli politics, as well as on the screen, caused an uproar with a vicious rant against Netanyahu supporters. Okay, we can remove that one too. Director Menahemi is not a war widow herself, but had a good sense of the demeanor of someone so stricken with sorrow. Her closest friend was twice widowed before the age of 30. That's the model for Miri in the film. Menahemi said, there's a lot of me in the sad widow, in her cynical and prickly sister, in the nerdy brother-in-law, in the adventurous young man, and also in the little boy who's searching for his missing mother. Noodle presents the Israeli war widow as never before in film or literature. Of course, there were earlier portrayals emphasizing her grief and the nation's gratitude. But this character study reveals the social and, above all, the emotional challenges she faces in trying to rebuild her life after such catastrophic loss. When historians consider the casualties of any war, they invariably estimate the numbers of dead, wounded, missing, and those taken prisoner. But the widows, usually young women, are casualties as well, regardless of victory or defeat on the battlefield. As one said after Israel's triumph in the Six-Day War, the country was euphoric, we won, but we widows lost. Israel is perpetually at war. There has been a major armed conflict in all but one of its 8 decades. And over 20,000 men in the IDF have been killed since 1948, a high number for such a small country. Many of the fallen were reservists. They had non-military occupations and were called up on short notice and quickly sent into battle fighting alongside regular troops. Outside the ultra-Orthodox community, which is exempt from military service, almost any able-bodied man up to the age of 40 can be required to go to war in an emergency. This is a fear expressed by a young wife in a popular song in the 1960s. Whenever we go out, there are 3: you, me, and the next war. After October 7th, as you all know, the IDF mobilized the citizen army, and that was over 1/3 reservists. Now, Noodle seems to be set in the late 1990s. You remember the flip phones of that era. Miri is 37. She could have married young and lost her first husband in Israel's disastrous invasion of Lebanon in 1982, which took the lives of about 700 soldiers and resulted in 315 war widows. The armed conflict with Lebanon has lasted in one form or another ever since. It could have caused her second widowhood as well. Significantly, neither of Miri's late husbands appear in the film in flashbacks. And there is little about how they were killed. We briefly see their photos, and she pantomimes for Noodle, one of them being shot in combat, and the other, a pilot, dying when his plane went down. By contrast, earlier movies featuring war widows dwelled on the courageous exploits of the fallen husband. One of them is called The Hero's Wife, the title conveying this notion of a widow basking in her husband's glory. The widow's identity being bound up with his bravery. These films often include the dead warrior's army buddies, one of whom is usually shown comforting or even courting the widow. Miri's grief is almost palpable, but her self-esteem is not a function of her husband's valor. And her social life is not dependent on her late spouse's male friends or the friends they had as a couple, or her two sets of former in-laws. No, she's on her own. This separation from past personal relationships was the pattern for most war widows, according to a landmark work published in 1986 by a prominent sociologist, herself a war widow. Let's look at the next slide. I'm speaking here of Leah Shamgar Handelman, and she was just an eminent sociology professor at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and published this, look at the subtitle, Beyond the Glory of Heroism. Her work relied on a sample of 78 women, each of whom had lost her husband in the Six-Day War. And beginning in 1972, were interviewed repeatedly over the next 5 years. So a longitudinal study. The book is filled with revealing, often heart-wrenching excerpts from these testimonies. Their situations differ by age, income, number of children, if any, and other factors. But several general themes emerged, and one was that, like Miri, the quantity and quality of their earlier friendships was greatly diminished. Okay, you can remove that slide. Thank you. At the Shiva and the period following it, they received many visitors, but then contact waned. When their husbands were alive, they usually went out together, socializing with other couples. But once they were single, this became uncomfortable, feeling like the fifth wheel of a wagon, as one said. Some added commonplace details, like the question of splitting a check at a restaurant. Easy if there are two couples. Awkward if there's one extra person alone. Or the uneasiness of going to certain events alone, such as an evening at a discotheque. In the early years of their bereavement, they were often invited to gatherings commemorating their late husbands. Perhaps the anniversary of a critical battle he had fought in. But over time, these invitations dropped off too. The widow's status fell as the years passed, and the widows of recent wars were more honored, because the media was dominated by the latest national trauma. And the new crop of war widows tended to monopolize the public's sympathy. War widows formed friendship circles and even organizations, but many of the participants in the study remained on the margins of those groups as well, because they didn't want to be defined by themselves or others as war widows. The main goal of all but one of the 78 interviewed was to remarry. They felt stigmatized by being single. And of course, this would have been the case even if they had not been war widows, because marriage in Israel has been the national panacea, according to one scholar, providing stability and security amidst all the uncertainties of life there. Matrimony is also considered an imperative because of the catastrophic losses of the Holocaust that need to be replenished, and the biblical commandment to be fruitful and multiply. Now, true, the emphasis on marriage in recent decades has decreased in developed countries, but it was much more common and aspired to a generation ago, especially in Israel. In the late 90s, when the film is set, only about 5% of Israeli adults had never married, compared to 18% in the United States at that time. A few women in the study, though, mentioned that their former in-laws urged them not to remarry, afraid that the memory of their son would be eclipsed by the presence of another man. None of the widows in the study were constrained by such pleading. As one said, "I'm still young. Am I to be sentenced to loneliness for eternity?" In this respect, we see Miri as an outlier. She remarried once, but now marriage is not her primary objective, even though she's pestered by her sister Gila repeatedly to find a husband. This kind of pressure from family, friends, even strangers was reported by many in the study. If upon meeting a new person, a woman would mention she's a war widow, the response would often be, "From when?" If it was a war more than a few years earlier, a question in the form of a judgment would follow. "And still not married?" With a compulsion to remarry so strong and evident in this group, participants often reported that they were seen by married women as a threat, as potential home wreckers, out to steal their husbands. And we see this in the film, when Gila again and again thinks Miri is trying to snatch Izzy away from her. In fact, he does have romantic feelings towards his sister-in-law, but she does not reciprocate. Some of the war widows said that they avoided socializing with couples altogether so as to avoid suspicion and gossip. Not the least of the war widows' problems is making a living. Only in the last few decades have Israeli mothers tended to work full-time outside the home. In earlier generations, losing a husband meant a widow leaving that conventional female role to find a job, often contending with misogyny, and supporting herself and any children, usually on a modest salary. We see Miri as a flight attendant, a demanding occupation. Now, from the beginning, the state recognized the economic bind of the war widow and approved lifetime stipends, in addition to any army pension or life insurance policy the husband may have had. The amounts varied by age, of course, the number of children. And for a childless woman like Miri, it would have been the equivalent of only a few $100s a month. After the Yom Kippur War, the Organization of War Widows actively lobbied the government to increase the monthly payments. Yet at one point, the Knesset passed a law ending the payments to childless war widows. The purpose was to prod them through economic necessity to remarry as soon as possible and have children. Let's look at the next slide. After a few years, this Knesset law was overturned by the efforts of a spirited group of women led by Ziba Bachman Flamhaft. herself a childless war widow who had lost her husband within a year of their marriage. She was pregnant at the time of his death, but later suffered a miscarriage and was thus denied the chance to give birth to her late husband's baby, further adding to her anguish. Her book reveals the political activism on the part of the war widows, something Miri refrains from. Although entitled War Widow, it could have been called Widow's War because of her belligerence against the establishment. Bachmann Flamhoft also discloses being aggressively pursued and even sexually abused by several of her late husband's military commanders, married men among them. Yet another vulnerability of the war widow. She lost her husband when she was 23, but did not divulge the toll on her personal life until age 73 in 2017. 10 years after the film Noodle helped pave the way for such openness. Okay, you can remove that slide. Thank you. Now, Miri, struggling to find meaning and purpose in life, is fortunately spared some of the pitfalls that have beset others in her situation. And she consciously avoids society's definitions and expectations of her. She adamantly rejects being pitied, and that causes one of the most bitter flare-ups with her sister. She is not fixated on remarriage and can support herself financially. But how can she come back into the world? How can she become emotionally attached, even love another person again? She is not shown to have any contact with her former in-laws, as I mentioned before, and unlike most of the war widows in the study, Miri does not even appear to have close female friends. Enter an adorable Chinese child. In a sense, they are both lost. He is literally lost, but she is too, having lost her way toward personal fulfillment. As you know, the boy's mother, a migrant cleaning lady, goes out for an hour, leaving her child behind, and never returns. We later learn that she was undocumented and summarily deported. Without being able to reunite with her son or even contact him or the Israeli woman she was working for. Is such a story plausible? Unfortunately, yes. Between 2002 and 2004, while the screenplay for this film was being written, there was a sweeping crackdown on foreign workers in Israel who were there illegally. And about 50,000 were picked up by the police, detained, and deported. The migrants themselves were made to pay for the plane trip back to their home country. Most could not afford that, of course. So the Israeli government arranged chartered flights for them, but seats were often unavailable for weeks, while the foreign workers sat in detention centers and in some cases in prison. In the film, we see the distress this policy caused when an immigration official coldly informs Miri and Gila that Noodle's mother was deported soon after she was arrested, but tells them that her fate is better than rotting away in jail. In separate interviews, both the director, Menahemi, and the actress playing Miri, Millie Avital, stressed that this tidal wave of arrests and expulsions and the plight of Israel's migrant workers in general was one of the main reasons they made the film. Now, the Jewish state is hardly alone in facing the challenges of bringing in foreign labor. This is a worldwide problem. In the post-war decades, France and West Germany each accepted, indeed invited in, several million guest workers from Algeria and Turkey, respectively, migrations with profound consequences that neither country could foresee or control. While it's impossible to get precise data, most estimates put the number of migrant workers in Israel today at about 100,000, and those there illegally at another 100,000. Altogether, around 5% of the entire workforce, but a much higher percentage of the country's farmhands, construction workers, and caregivers. Let's look at the next slide. Here, thank you for enlarging that. Thank you. Here you can see where they come from, and look, Thailand has the most in the blue at the upper right. They come mostly from Thailand and other Asian countries, such as the Philippines, also has a very large contingent. Nepal, India, Sri Lanka, and as we see in the film, China. And some from Eastern Europe, West Africa, and Latin America. Now here, China is at 9%, but they had gone down lower than that, and then came back to 9%, and it's now on the upswing. If this chart had been done just a year later, China would be even higher than 9%. That's because they work on Beijing's lucrative construction projects there, including the ports of Haifa and Ashdod. Okay, can remove that now. The two nations, Israel and China, forged many ties beginning in the 1990s when the film is set. Diplomatic relations, economic cooperation, military equipment and technology, and educational and cultural exchanges. A vibrant NGO called Signal has the goal of furthering these bonds. And on our study tour of China in 2019, there are several here tonight who were participants in that. We met with academics and journalists at the universities of Nanjing and Beijing and found much pro-Israel sentiment, far different than the anti-Zionism so prevalent on American college campuses. Now, Israel, in its early decades, had almost no migrant workers from Asia or anywhere else. This was due to the concept in socialist Zionism, which was dominant until 1977, the concept of avodah ivrit, Hebrew labor. It meant that Jews themselves ought to perform even the most physically demanding tasks, especially plowing the rocky soil in order to break their dependence on trade and the professions and become a normal people, quote unquote, normal people. But this changed when Israel became more developed economically, and a free market ethos gradually took hold. The second generation turned toward higher paying jobs in the expanding industries of finance, medical research, tourism, high tech. But who would now supply the manual labor? Just at this time, an almost unlimited pool of skilled and unskilled workers emerged. Palestinians from the occupied territories under Israeli control beginning in 1967. Laborers from the West Bank and Gaza could be hired, often at low wages, for work that many Jews now scorned. This kind of toil that had been valued by early Zionists was now derided as avodah aravit, Arab labor. But after the outbreak of the First Intifada in 1987, Israeli employers reevaluated this arrangement. Given the riots, the stone throwing, the vandalism, and car bombings, which lasted 5 years, the Palestinians from the occupied territories were considered a security risk. In fact, any Palestinian from the occupied territories could be subject to long delays at military checkpoints and thus be unable to get to his or her job in time. That is when foreign labor began in Israel, in the late 80s during the Intifada. And by 1996, there were 100,000 migrant workers in the country, 23,000 from China alone. Let's look at the next slide. And here, if you go around Israel, these are scenes that you would see. On this page, these are two showing Thai workers in the agricultural sector. And this is very, very common in Israel today. Now let's look at the next one. Here we see them as Filipinos as caregivers. You see people who are disabled and need help. These are just very common on the streets of Israel. You can see the important work that they do, and it's work that many Israelis just would rather not perform. Okay, we can remove that slide. Thank you. Now, unfortunately, Israel, like many other countries, has not properly regulated migrant labor. And that's led to many workers having been exploited and middlemen being enriched at their expense. A Filipino, say, seeking to earn money in Israel to benefit his family, has to pay a recruiter in Manila a placement fee that typically ranges from $5,000 to $10,000. Few have this amount, so it's borrowed either from friends or family or from the recruiting agency itself at sky-high interest rates. Thus, the foreign worker is saddled with debt from the outset, And the Filipino recruiter then pays half the placement fee to an Israeli manpower agency that arranges the work assignment. Now, wages, I mean, they differ, of course, in terms of the kind of job, but on the average, about $7 an hour, a bit over $1,000 a month. Higher for migrants in Israel than in most other countries. In fact, even higher than they would receive in the wealthy Persian Gulf states, but generally without benefits or insurance. Those who work in the cities, as the film vividly shows, have sometimes been crowded into rundown, unsanitary tenements, locked during the day. When Noodle breaks in by precariously climbing along the ledge of the top story, squeezing through a window, you sense it's not the first time he's had to do that. Now, although the temporary visa can last for 5 years, many migrants are there illegally because it's usually valid for only one specified employer. If for any reason you need to leave and get another job, you no longer have official permission to remain in the country. The question of undocumented aliens should be very familiar to Americans. Although the difference is that except for some asylum seekers from Sudan and Eritrea, few migrants in Israel have crossed the border illegally. It's rather that they've been issued work permits, but these frequently become null and void after they've been in the country. And the cumbersome, often callous bureaucracy, so often disparaged by Israelis themselves, was certainly feckless during that first influx of guest workers in the 1990s, as we see in the film. Now, thankfully, legislative reforms and an agreement with Thai officials have resulted in reforms regarding the exorbitant placement fees, at least from that country, Thailand. This was initiated in 2018, an important first step. But since then, existential crises such as the pandemic and the struggle for democracy and security have pushed this issue to the back burner. But in light of the great pain suffered by Israel's migrant community on and after October 7th, I think the government may soon act even more decisively to ease their burden. Let's look at the next slide. Now, here we have photos of at the top of released Thai hostages. The New York Times actually did a story about the young man on the left, and he's back in Thailand now. There he is calling home. If you look at the one on the top right, those are released Thai hostages, and the woman in the center, though, is an Israeli citizen who speaks Thai and trying to help them. Almost all of the foreign workers who were ultimately released from captivity in Gaza had no family in Israel welcoming them home. But the Israeli health system and altruistic individuals have tried to comfort and care for them. Now, a positive note, clearly reflected in Noodle, is that the Israeli public due to its credit, has been relatively tolerant of foreign laborers compared with the way they're treated in other countries. Think about the animus toward them in our own country. Over the years, there have been occasional anti-Asian slurs by Knesset members and a few instances of harassment on the streets, but these have been exceedingly rare. And if you look at the photo at the bottom, this is actually a demonstration in which Israelis demanded that Israel bring in more foreign caregivers. Again, you see this is such a demanding job and so important. And it's these migrants that hold so many of these jobs. Okay, we can remove that slide. Now, if the guest workers have been accepted in Israel, why did Prime Minister Sharon order the widespread deportation of illegal migrants? The harsh measure that led in large part to the making of the film, the reason that Noodle is separated from his mother. It was not due to a bigoted nativist backlash against Asians that might have been the case elsewhere. Rather, the cause was a big spike in Israeli unemployment, going up to 13% in 2002. The cabinet felt it needed to free up jobs for its citizens, although it turned out not many wanted these jobs. In any case, a few years later, when unemployment dropped, the migrant workers program, with all its flaws, returned in full force and has expanded ever since. By the way, there is mutual respect between the Chinese and the Jews. Each ancient civilizations that highly value education and family, each having gained true independence in the late 1940s. China has experienced relatively little anti-Semitism over the centuries. Stereotypes abound, like that of the Jews controlling the world economy, but many Chinese actually admire them for that and would like to imitate Jewish financial success. There have been best-selling books there with titles such as The Talmud, The Secret of Getting Rich. Now, let me conclude with a final thought about director Ayelet Menahemi's edifying, uplifting message. An Israeli war widow and the child of an undocumented mother have nothing in common, cannot even converse. Yet when they come together, something magical happens. She saves the boy and he saves her, awakening feelings of compassion, protectiveness, and love that had been long dormant. If something bad should happen, it will happen to me, Miri says. Fate had been so cruel to her. But her high-risk plan to reunite the child with his mother succeeds brilliantly, boosting her self-confidence, giving her the deep satisfaction of performing such a mitzvah. In the end, she and the boy are both rescued. And as one reviewer put it, this is expressed in the name of the Beijing restaurant where the reunion takes place. Double happiness. Thank you.
Fred, that was terrific. Gave us some insight into the movie at a much different level than what was originally at the surface there. Are there any other questions people would like to ask? I'll start out with one myself, but if you have a question, please put it in the chat box and we'll present it to Fred. Fred, earlier on in the movie, you mentioned that how this film had some sort of relation or correlation to the tragedy of October 7th. And I wonder if you could elaborate that a little bit more.
Yeah, I'll say a little more about that. When Reba and I decided that this was a film, that we would show and that I would speak about, it was months before October 7th.
Mm.
And so this was just almost uncanny that these events emerged. A film about a twice widowed, woman. And also the migrants I saw that they were taken hostage, and as I said, 39 were killed. So this all came home, to me. And it was actually, I must say, working on this talk, for me, it was very emotional, given the background of events in the Middle East while I was preparing this. But as you can see, both of these issues now are more salient than they were before. It's just that, but I really wanted to convey the tragedy of the war widow, which so often is, is forgotten.
Yeah, it's interesting how real life can sometimes imitate art and vice versa.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I didn't realize the migrant workers were involved on October 7th to the degree they were. I'm glad you brought that home. We obviously saw the tragedy there. We have time for one more question. If there is anyone out there, Fred's program, which was terrific, ran a little bit late. Anybody else? If not, we'll adjourn our evening tonight. Fred, any closing remarks before we say goodnight?
Yeah, well, just in this film, in a number of others, I mean, when you go beneath the surface, you can really see that something that on one level is a story, even humorous, but then when you dig deep, you see it's really a very, very important comment on society. And that's what a great filmmaker, can produce. And that's, what I think of Ayelet Menahemi. One last thing, after another hiatus of a decade and a half, she just released another film in just a few months ago. And that film is called Sheva Brachot, Seven Blessings. And it's about a raucous Moroccan family in Jerusalem. And that's Israel's entry into the Academy Awards for Best Foreign Film, and I'm going to be waiting to see if that will be nominated.
It turns out that we're going to be showing that film in our festival coming up, which will be the last 6 days of February in the theater, and then followed a week later with our virtual festival. So people certainly check that out if you have at all interest. This was a terrific film.
Mention that, and then if you've seen this, you can see what path she's taken, and a woman of such creativity. See what her latest work is.
Well, Reva, in her infinite wisdom, has seen to put this movie, Seven Blessings, as our closing movie for the in-theater. So hopefully everyone can get a chance to check that out. Fred, thank you so much. You're always informative and enjoyable, and we look forward to doing it again.
Thank you all, folks, and Happy New Year. Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody.